Good evening and welcome. I'm Jenny Lawrence, a longtime member of the library and a former trustee. And before we begin, a few words about the New York Society Library, the city's first library, more than a century before the New York Public Library opened its doors. It was founded in 1754 by a group of civic-minded people intent on creating, quote, a public library that would be very useful as well as ornamental to this city. In its 269 years, the library has closed its doors only 3 times: during the American Revolution, during a yellow fever outbreak in 1803, and finally during COVID's 3-month lockdown in 2020. Truly one of the most resilient and enduring institutions in New York City history. And speaking of history, Evan Thomas will talk tonight about his new book, his 10th, Road to Surrender, 3 Men and the Countdown to World War II, which will be released tomorrow.
11th. Who's counting?
11th?
11th, I think so.
11th. No. For those of you who cannot wait until the 11th, books are for sale just outside this room. Evan began his career as a journalist at the Bergen Record, then moved to Time magazine before joining the staff at Newsweek for the next 24 years. He was also a panelist for 20 years on the weekly roundtable television show Inside Washington. He has taught writing and journalism at Harvard, and at Princeton was for 7 years the Ferris Professor of Journalism. Evan is a master of a you are there narrative style and an eye for telling detail from multiple perspectives in such books as Ike's Bluff, President Eisenhower's secret battle to save the world, and the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines called Sea of Thunder, 4 naval commanders in the last sea war. Needless to say, prodigious research underlies these seamless narratives. As introducer, I had the privilege of reading an advance copy of Road to Surrender. Before I'd even opened the book, I was impressed with the praise on the jacket from Stacy Schiff, Lynn Olson, and John Meacham. Then I started reading Road to Surrender on a recent Saturday. By the time I'd closed the book later that day, it was Nathaniel Philbrick's quote that resonated. Quote, a terrifying, heartbreaking account of 3 men under unimaginable pressure. This is history that crackles with journalistic immediacy. I challenge you not to read this book in a single sitting. As Walter Isaacson commented, quote, this dramatic, in-the-moment masterpiece provides a convincing explanation of one of the great moral questions of 20th century history. Was America right to drop the atom bomb on Japan at the end of World War II? This is an indispensable book for those who want to understand the moral issues surrounding the use of great power. Road to Surrender is a must-read, a history that should never be forgotten, particularly as we navigate the ever more perilous world of today. Please welcome Evan and Oscie Thomas.
Thank you, Jenny.
Hi, I want to thank everyone for being here. It's so nice to see friends and family, and especially Kate Medina in the back, who is Evan's editor at Random House. Evan and I sent the book to a friend named David Vondraley. He is a deputy editor of the opinion page at the Washington Post and a great writer and columnist. And he emailed back yesterday, so I want to start out by reading his email. Your book arrived, and though I am pulled in 10 directions lately, I made the mistake of looking at the first page. It's now 30 minutes later. Wow. The introduction is one of the best I have ever read. crisp, authoritative, going like a bat out of hell. So, Evan, why did you write this book?
I grew up in the 1950s, and I was scared of the A-bomb. I'm still scared. Actually, maybe I'm more scared reading the newspapers. I'm also the son of a World War II veteran who was the executive officer on an LST who was scheduled to be in the invasion of Japan. And like, a lot of people, my sisters are here, we always sort of subscribe to the myth if it wasn't for the A-bomb, we wouldn't be alive. I'll get to that. I think that maybe is a myth. But in any case, I grew up with it. But I was always troubled by the question of, did we really need to use that thing? And did we need to use two of them? And wasn't there some way we could have run a test or a demonstration or something to avoid using it?
So you tell this gripping story through three characters, two American, Secretary of War, and the general in charge of the Air Force, strategic bombing, and also a third, a Japanese character. So how did you choose your characters?
When I was at Newsweek, working for news magazines, we had something that we called the Russian novel problem. Real life is a Russian novel. Too many plots, too many characters. And so if you're writing history, you have to figure out how to narrow it down, if you can, without being faithful to the truth, to figure out who to tell the story through. Now, Harry Truman is an obvious choice, but he was problematic. General Groves, the general who ran the Manhattan Project, once said that Harry Truman was just like a little boy on a toboggan, meaning sliding down the hill, couldn't control it, beyond his control. That's not fair. Truman did make the decision, but he made up a lot of stuff about his own role in the atom bomb, so he was a problematic character. The other sort of obvious character would be Oppenheimer, but Oppenheimer's been done. The book won the Pulitzer Prize. There's a movie coming out about him in a month. I hope to hop on that train with this book. But I wanted to find people you maybe haven't heard of, but who were central to the story.
The Secretary of War was Henry Stimson. Now, he's a central figure, 77 years old. He's been in the government for decades, serving as Secretary of State, Secretary of War in an earlier administration. He has a serious heart condition at this point. He's been Secretary of War under Franklin Roosevelt, who had died in April. And maybe the telling factor is that his favorite sport is lawn bowls. So tell us about him.
It's easy to make Henry Stimson look slightly ridiculous. He was the chairman of the board of what now is quaintly known as the Eastern Foreign Policy Establishment. He was a very kind of erect statesman, godfather of the wise men that Walter and Isaacson and I wrote about a long time ago. But one thing about Stimson, he had a diary. And if you're writing these books, you need diaries to be able to tell the story. And his diary showed that even though he was a very stiff upper lip guy, he really struggled with this. He really agonized. He couldn't sleep. By the spring of 1945, he knows, and the book begins in March, he knows that we're going to have a bomb that works, and we're probably going to have to use it, that the time is coming. And he writes in the diary, he refers to the bomb as S1, which is his code name, and he also calls it tube alloys, which is the British code name, but he also calls it the terrible, the awful, the diabolical. He knows what he's dealing with. And he and his wife, Mabel, who's a wonderful character, they go down to Miami just to recover in April. And they go to a Air Force redistribution center, which is sending people who fought in Europe over to the Pacific for the final assault on Japan. And he sees how exhausted they are. And he knows that they will fight, that they will do their job, but he really doesn't want to have to send them into battle again. As it turned, 2 days before we go down there, we have finally, the United States has finally won Iwo Jima. It took us 5 weeks and 7,000 men to capture an island the size of Nantucket. Okinawa was next. That was twice as bad. Well, multiply many Iwo Jimas and many Okinawas, and you have the invasion of Japan. So he just doesn't want to do it. At the same time, he is very troubled because we have been firebombing Japan. Starting in March, when we killed 100,000 people in Japan and Tokyo in one night, we've been methodically firebombing cities there, and this really bothers him. He says in this impossible situation of statesmen of having to kill people to save people. I mean, it's a gruesome moral equation.
And the firebombing, Curtis LeMay has started the firebombing because precision bombing has not been working.
Yeah, they wanted to bomb precisely, but as it turned out, these new bombers we had, these B-29s, we discovered the jet stream. They were being blown off target by the jet stream. The first time they were trying to bomb from 30,000 feet, and we kept missing. So went in low and dropped napalm on it, and it's an impossible situation. And so Stimson goes to President Truman, and he tells him he wants to cut back on the firebombing for 2 reasons. One, he doesn't want to be like the Germans. He doesn't want to be like Hitler, accused of atrocities. But 2, he is worried that if we bomb all these cities, there won't be any left to show off how powerful our new weapon is. Very grim irony. And he writes in his diary that Truman gave a little laugh. You know it was a bitter laugh. These are men using dark humor because they're in an impossible place. Wars are easy to start, but hard to end.
You talk about the impossibility of their situation. This is a bomb that's never been used. It's just being created. It hasn't even been tested. And do they know what they have and how powerful it will be?
No, they don't. Oppenheimer, who's the scientist who developed this bomb, says to the little group that's running this whole show that it might be between 2 and 20 kilotons. Well, Hiroshima was 12 kilotons, Nagasaki was 20, so it turned out to be at the upper end. Oppenheimer estimated it would kill 20,000 people. Actually, it killed 70,000 instantly and another 70,000 slowly by radiation sickness.
So Japan is not surrendering after, even though we're coming closer to the home islands, and the U.S. has to choose their targets. And what does Truman say about the targeting?
So the night that Truman gives the order to drop the bomb, he writes in his diary, he writes, I have instructed the Secretary of War, Stimson, and he and I are in agreement that the bomb should be used against a purely military target, aimed at soldiers and sailors and not women and children. He writes this in his diary. Well, Hiroshima is a city. The aim point for the bomb was a bridge smack in the middle of the city, which is surrounded by wooden homes. Yes, about 10,000 soldiers did die, but the other 60,000 were civilians, and most of them, of course, were women and children.
I just wonder how Truman could be so mistaken, but also how he felt about it once he realized.
Well, terrible. I mean, terrible once he realized it. And in fact, he took control of the bomb. He'd sort of given over control and wrote about all these women and children. So he did wake up to it. But, you know, it's just not clear. When you're writing history, sometimes it isn't clear what's going on. And there's human denial is always involved. Why did he make that diary entry? Maybe he didn't want to know. Maybe he was writing it for history. That wouldn't be the first time somebody wrote a diary entry for history. But also during the day, when he was talking to Stimson, to Secretary Stimson, Stimson had emphasized that they were saving Kyoto. Well, Kyoto was the great cultural capital of Imperial Japan, and Stimson had taken it off the target list. General Groves kept putting it back on the target list. Stimson took it off the target list 3 times. And so it may be that they felt, and maybe this is rationalization, but Stimson and Truman were thinking, well, we saved Kyoto. Hiroshima is a military city. It has military targets in it, but mostly actually the port on the periphery, not in the middle where they were dropping the bomb. They had to pick the middle because they had to make sure they were going to hit the thing. If they aimed at the periphery, they might miss. You know, it's just the realities of modern warfare.
The order goes out July 25th, just after the Trinity test, the successful Trinity test in New Mexico, and it's to drop the bomb on 4 cities, each of 4 cities, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Niigata, and Kokura, to be bombed as the bombs are made ready. So there are 2 available in early August, and the other 2, until, as Evan said, Truman sees the pictures and says, no, I need to prove them, the order had been to drop 2 more. So the order goes from Stimson to Karl Spaatz, General Tui Spaatz. Who is he?
So Tui Spaatz is somebody you probably never heard of. He ran the air war in Europe, the strategic bombing of Europe. And he was being brought from Europe to the Pacific for the final assault on Japan. A very low-key, admirable figure. He wasn't a strutter. He wasn't a blowhard. He had no patent in him. Very dutiful, uncomplaining guy. Carried out orders. But it really bothered him. He agonized over this. And he would let off steam. He would try to relax by gambling, by playing poker. A few nights after they bombed Dresden, you know, the bombing of Dresden, British and American planes basically torched a beautiful medieval city, killing tens of thousands of people. Tui Spaatz blew $1,700, 2 months' salary, on a game of poker. And his granddaughter told me about this. She had a letter from Spaatz' assistant to Spaatz' wife explaining how he had just blown 2 months' salary. And, you know, she understood it because that's the way it was. Now, Spaatz, when he was told that he was going to drop the atom bomb, he verbally told that he'd have to drop the atom bomb on Japan. He said, I want a written order, no verbal order. If I'm going to kill 100,000 people, I want to see it in writing. So he carried this order in his back pocket, in his wallet in his back pocket, and almost got lost when an aide took his pants off to be cleaned.
So the Hiroshima run on August 6th was Paul Tibbets at the control as the Enola Gay. That was considered a perfect mission. And 3 days later, the Nagasaki run is nothing but snake bit. So
everything, as can happen in these things, even though you practice forever, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. First of all, their rendezvous failed, so they wasted 45 minutes. They got to their target, Kokura. It was fogged, clouded in. Actually, it was covered by smoke from an earlier bombing raid, so they couldn't drop the bomb there. They went on to Nagasaki. That was also overcast. At the last second, they weren't supposed to bomb by radar. It was supposed to be visual. The last second, a little opening moves, and the bombardier says, I see it, and they drop the bomb. They've used up so much fuel that they think they're going to have to ditch. When they finally land, emergency landing in Okinawa, firing off all their flares, they left with 35,000 gallons of gas. They had 7 gallons left. And they went in and reported to General Doolittle, who was head of the 8th Army, and they said, you know, we were off target. We missed the target by a mile. They were up a valley, so we probably didn't kill as many civilians. And General Doolittle said, you know, that will make General Spaatz happy that you did not kill so many civilians. Actually, by accident, they dropped the bomb on top of the Mitsubishi torpedo factory that had been used to make the torpedoes for Pearl Harbor. So there was a kind of grim justice there. But it was very telling that Doolittle knew that Spaatz would be happy that it was off target and they didn't kill so many people.
So moving to the Japanese side, what about them? Who is Togo?
So our third character, and really the hero of the book, is a guy named Shigenori Togo, who's the foreign minister. He's a very dour figure, kind of a grumpy figure. He had married to a German wife and loved the Germans, but he loved the good Germany. He read Goethe and Schiller, and he hated, they thought Hitler was a thug. He thought the Nazis were thugs. And very uncharacteristic for the Japanese. Togo was blunt. He was very plain-spoken, very blunt. The Japanese, as you know, but probably many of you know, especially if you've dealt with them, can be very indirect. But Togo was honest and direct, and he was on this. He was on something called the Supreme War Council. Japan at the end of the war is run by something called the Supreme War Council. 6 people, 5 of them are military, generals and admirals, and Togo's the only civilian. And they are a tough group. In Japan, in the government, they are forbidden to use the word surrender. They cannot use the word surrender because Japan, supposedly, mythologically, has not surrendered in 2,600 years. That's actually not true, but that was part of the Bushido myth. And so there was, in the top ranks, a great fear of the middle ranks, the hotheads, the colonels who ran the bureaucracy and had, if they didn't like who was in charge, they'd kill them. They used to call it government by assassination in Tokyo. In the 1930s, 3 prime ministers are assassinated. And the current prime minister, Admiral Suzuki, had been the Lord Chamberlain in 1936. He still had 4 bullets in him from where they had tried to assassinate him. He could still feel the bullets. It's an amazing story. The assassin shot him 4 times, and he's lying there in a pool of blood, and his wife comes and says to the assassins, "May I finish him?" And they said, "Okay," and they leave, and she's bluffing.
They give her a sword.
They give her a sword. She's bluffing. She does it to save him. The Japanese are different, particularly in the 1930s.
So how does Togo deal with this fear of the underlings, the hotheads?
Well, he gets the Supreme War Council to meet in secret so that the aides won't be there, so they can try to have an honest conversation about surrender. It doesn't really work. His confreres are determined to fight to the bitter, bitter end. To show you, on August 9th, now we've already bombed Hiroshima. This is 3 days later. The Supreme War Council is meeting, and the night before, at midnight the night before, the Russians have invaded Manchuria, Japanese-occupied Manchuria. Thousands of Russians are pouring over so they've got another front war here. And as they're meeting, word comes that a second, quote, Hiroshima-type bomb has fallen on Nagasaki. So they have 2 atom bombs. And what happens? The war minister, Anami, says, well, wouldn't it be beautiful for the whole nation to die like a beautiful flower, like a cherry blossom? She says, wouldn't it be beautiful if Japan was I don't have the Japanese word, but it became like a shattered jewel. And then he says, let them drop 100 bombs.
So he's a fanatic. And the Supreme War Council is deadlocked. In fact, if he were to resign, the government would fall. And so where is the emperor in all this?
Well, he's divine. You know, he reports to the gods. But, of course, not really. Power actually rests with the military in Japan and their complicated system. And the way it worked was that the Supreme War Council would bring a decision to the emperor, and he would say nothing. His silence meant assent, that he'd confirm it. The idea was that he was supposed to be above politics and therefore above blame. Now, Hirohito was afraid of his own generals, or wary of his own generals. They had prepared an armored train to take him up into the mountains to their secret redoubt where they were going to have their last stand. But he said no. Although he appeared to be, he was a meek figure in some ways and looked meek, he was beginning to stand up to the generals. And he had also, his own palace, which is actually 32 buildings in this enclosure, had been largely burned by American firebombs in May. And so he knows, they're listening to the radio traffic, he thinks the next one's coming for him. So he now calls a meeting, a secret meeting in his own bunker beneath the library, and he lectures the generals and admirals and says they've been lying to him. And he says that he agrees with Togo, with the foreign minister, that we must accept the American demand for surrender.
So the emperor, who was silent before, has now spoken. And is that it? Is it over?
No. It's always more complicated. In fact, not at all. The Japanese, when they accept the surrender demands, say, okay, we'll surrender, but the emperor must remain sovereign. After all, the emperor reports to God. Well, this is totally unacceptable to the Americans, and Secretary Stimson sees this right away when they get the cable. And so the Americans, we reply, yes, you can keep the emperor, but the emperor must be subject to the supreme Allied commander, to Douglas MacArthur. Well, the war minister in Ami and his crew, they're not going to buy that either. So we're really, in a way, right back at square one. The militarists want to keep fighting. Let's keep fighting. The emperor, no, he's wobbling, but he says no.
He's willing to accept the American conditions, one of which is that the ultimate form of government will be as freely expressed by the people. And his advisors are saying, you can't accept that. And he says, it's very Western, well, if the people don't want me, it won't matter what the language is.
But the young hotheads want to keep fighting. They just don't want to give up. In fact, they've begun plotting a coup to help the emperor, save the emperor, really, from himself. And the army minister, the war minister, Anami, who's been a murky figure in all this, who's been encouraging him, he commits hara-kiri. He takes his sword and plunges it into his stomach, and then a second sword, and goes like that. His young proteges, meanwhile, murder the head of the Imperial Guard and create false orders so that they get control of the palace. Well, the emperor had secretly recorded his surrender speech. It's supposed to be given to the nation on the radio the next day at noon. And now these soldiers are running through the palace looking for that record to smash it, to break it. Fortunately, it's in a bag that's been hidden in a chamber that belongs to the ladies in waiting, the empress's ladies in waiting.
So most people don't realize we were getting ready, we were then assembling, because Japan was not surrendering, a third bomb to drop on Tokyo.
Truman, we know this because Truman, the cable from the British, Truman reluctantly tells the British ambassador that he's going to have to drop a third bomb, this one on Tokyo. Just 4 hours later, he finds out the Japanese are surrendering, and this time it's for real. The war is finally ending.
So the war is over, and tell us what happened to the three characters, the men.
Well, Togo, our hero, is sentenced to 20 years as a war criminal because he was in the cabinet during the time of Pearl Harbor. We should have given him the world should have given him a medal. He saved millions of people. He dies in prison.
And in 1941, he was trying to persuade Japan not to attack America.
This gets, he wasn't, at least he wasn't sentenced to death,
Yeah.
the way most of them were. They thought he got a light sentence of 20 years. Tui Spots is stoic but miserable. He can't sleep. He had written in his diary on August 11th, which is after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he wrote, I was against the atom bomb. This is in his own private diary, because I was always against wiping out cities full of civilians. But he had been persuaded, correctly, that it would save more lives than it would lose. But, it's not really a consolation if you've done this kind of thing, who has, but he had to live with it. And they made him Air Force Chief of Staff, where he rejected any idea of a preemptive strike on Russia, any of that. He was definitely in the camp of no first use. The United States will never be the first to use a nuclear weapon. And his granddaughter told me that up to the end of his life, he would wander the house. He couldn't sleep, giving off this kind of low moan. And right before he died, he confessed to her. He said, "I've never said this to anybody, but I regret this, that we used the atom bomb." He was racked with guilt. Stimson, same thing. Stimson, it begins early. On the morning, on August 8th, or 9th, August 8th, on August 8th, when he shows the photographs of what Hiroshima looks like after the bomb to President Truman, he brings him the photographs, the aerial photographs. And what the photographs look like are the inside of an emptied ashtray. I mean, there's nothing left but gray ash. And Stimson that morning has a small heart attack. Now, a coincidence? I don't think so. It shocks the hell out of Truman as well. That's when Oscie already mentioned he takes back control of the bomb to himself. Amazingly, Truman didn't even know when the second mission was going. He was paying his bills at home. He didn't even know the second mission was going to Nagasaki because he had delegated so much authority. But he takes the authority back, and he starts worrying about women and children. Stimson is racked by guilt. He has a big heart attack shortly after the war. He does try. He goes to Truman and he says we should share the secret of the atom bomb with Russia.
And what's he thinking?
What he's thinking is arms control. Let's get a nuclear freeze, basically, and have arms control. But it's too late. The Cold War has begun. Truman seems to agree with them and doesn't really agree with them. And the cat is out of the bag. And the arms race begins.
Does Russia, you mentioned Russia, do they have territorial ambitions on Japan?
They do. Most people don't know this either, but after Japan surrendered, Russia invaded the northernmost Japanese island, Hokkaido, and there was a battle there, quite a big battle. The only thing that held the Russians back from really coming on was they didn't have ships. They didn't have sea lift. America had all the ships. The Japanese had insisted the Russians had insisted that they be co-supreme rulers of Japan. We were able to say no because Russia didn't have any ships.
And they'd only been in the war for a couple of days.
For a couple of days. But it's a good thing they didn't have any ships, or that the war didn't go on, because they would have gotten there sooner or later. And imagine the consequences of a half-communist Japan. It'd be like Korea, possibly with the same consequences. So we're lucky they didn't get there.
And guilt's a terrible thing to live with when you're following orders. How do you think Spatz and Stimson should have felt?
I don't. How are we to know what they really felt? But should they have felt guilty? No, in this sense. I think the scholarship's pretty clear now that those bombs saved millions of lives, not just American lives, but Japanese and Asian lives. On the American side, we were planning to invade Japan, but by early August, our intelligence, our radio intercepts, had discovered that there were not just 300,000 or 400,000 troops on this southern end of the island. We were going to land on the first invasion in the Kyushu, the southernmost island, and the Japanese knew it. And they had 1 million, by early August, they had 1 million men down there, well, larger than our invasion force. And they not only had 1 million men, they had 7,000 kamikaze planes, they had kamikaze swimmers and mines and all that. And so the Navy and the Air Force withdrew their conditional approval of the invasion. They didn't want to invade anymore. They wanted to strangle Japan by blockading them. And by August, we had figured out how to bomb the Japanese. Would burn 60 cities. Now we'd figured out how to bomb their rail lines. So we were about to starve them. About 70% of the population of Japan lives on the Kanto Plain, and they weren't going to get any rice. They were already down to 1,500 calories a day. By, say, Christmas, there was going to be mass famine. And with famine comes disease, comes civil war. So a lot of Japanese were going to die, and not just in Japan. Japan, as you know, obviously had occupied great chunks of Asia brutally, and people were dying at the rate of 250,000 a month. For instance, in Vietnam, there was a famine because Japan had taken the entire rice crop in order to try to make fuel out of rice. So people were dying in Vietnam. That stopped. The American ships arrived with grain. So it's hard to know the number. These are all counterfactuals. But those bombs perversely saved, they killed 200,000 people, but they saved many, many more.
Back to a question you asked yourself at the beginning, which is, well, could we have dropped a demonstration bomb and expected Japan to surrender based on what they would see?
They did discuss this, and Oppenheimer said, you know, this bomb is just going to be a big firecracker. It's going to have a big flash, but it's not going to leave much of a crater. And they worried that if they told the Japanese that we were doing this, the Japanese would shoot the plane down, or they would bring in prisoners of war for us to bomb, or the bomb would be a dud. Remember, we only had 2 of them. And so that idea actually was fairly quickly rejected.
The last question I have is, before asking for your question, is what are the lessons for today?
Well, this is a book very much about moral ambiguity. You know, we live in an age now where we're all moralistic and everybody's, I'm right, you're wrong, and my group is right and your group is wrong. I want to write about really hard decisions and just how hard it was. But there's no ambiguity about one thing. We can never use these bombs again.
The world.
The world can never use these, but not just the United States. And the problem is, and Oscie and I have talked about this, the taboo is wearing off. You know, Oppenheimer, all the way back in 1945, when his own scientists were getting upset about the bomb they had created, and Oppenheimer gave him a speech saying, this will be the last time. We'll use it once, and it'll be so horrible, we'll never use it again. Well, that taboo actually did affect policymakers for a very long time. But I fear as the further you get away, the more the taboo wears off. Also, in 1945, we didn't have to worry about escalation because we were the only ones who had the bomb. Today, Russia's got plenty of bombs. China has just built whole silo fields. Iran can get a bomb. India's got a bomb. Or Pakistan's got a bomb. There are plenty of people who have bombs. And so the potential for escalation is much greater. Also, the bombs are different. Oppenheimer warned about this, but do you know the average nuclear bomb that's put on the ICBM is 100 times the size of the Hiroshima
More
bomb.
powerful.
100 times more powerful. And the Hiroshima type bomb, that's a tactical weapon today. That's a firecracker compared to what they've got. So, you know, Hiroshima, that's Central Park and these environs. A real nuclear weapon, all of New York, all 5 boroughs. You know, the stakes could not be higher. All of this makes me hope that the decision makers who we have and we choose and the world has are as wise really as Stimson, Spots, and Togo. Thank you.
Questions, Missy.
I'm only imposing this question on you because you've done so much writing about World War II in the Pacific, the way they go. I've heard this theory about dropping the bomb that if MacArthur hadn't said to the Philippines, I will return, there was a whole other way we would have gotten to Japan and gotten there quickly and never had to confront the idea of dropping the bomb. Do you give that any credence?
No. I just read a biography of Nimitz, really terrific. They're called Nimitz at War. I highly recommend it. And this came up, and it is true they were all catering to MacArthur. It was impossible. But I think the modern scholarship is that even if we had skipped the Philippines, we would have gotten all tangled up over, the alternative was to take Taiwan. That was going to be a mess too. There was no way we were going to avoid a grinding, awful war, because as we were saying, the Japanese were determined to fight to the bitter end. It's not quite as nutty as it seems in this sense. The Japanese knew they were defeated. You know, their ships had been sunk, their cities were being burned. They weren't trying to win. What they wanted was good conditions. They didn't want to be occupied, and they didn't want to have war crime trials, because the war crime trials were going to take out the leadership. So what they really wanted was good terms, and it was not totally nutty. They had what was the name, this Japanese word for this, shikuku or something, the bleeding strategy. They wanted to bleed the Americans until we said, okay, you know, we'll give you good terms. That was not crazy. What changed the equation was 2 nuclear bombs.
One thing Togo recognized about the idea of good conditions was that it would permit the military, the generals and admirals on the Supreme War Council, to claim that they hadn't lost the war.
Yeah, right.
It would be a little like the Germans after World War I.
It's out of our hands.
Jen?
How did you find out about Togo? Did he keep a diary, or did he have a
Good question.
granddaughter?
Yeah,
Did he keep
yes.
writing in prison?
Yes, he did. He wrote a memoir in prison, which is very dry in Japanese. Japanese, the saying, never speak ill of the dead. The Japanese actually mean it. We don't, they do. And so their memoirs are difficult to deal with. But it was semi-truthful. And I got interested in reading about him. I could tell he was this figure. There are a lot of diaries out there. And I could tell he was an important figure. And I got curious about him because he's the one-of. And this is the way these books work. Serendipity. I had heard from a Washington Post journalist named T.R. Reid that Togo had a grandson named Shige who worked for the Washington Post. And I sort of filed that away. I actually wrote Shige an email years ago, got no response. Then I heard from another friend that there was another grandson named Kazu. And so I got in touch with Kazu, and we were supposed to go to Japan. COVID closed that down, but thank goodness for Zoom. We started Zooming, Oscie and I, Kazu and Shige, our new best friends. And, you've all seen the movie Lost in Translation. We had a wonderful Princeton PhD, Brian Walsh, always on the Zoom with us, who was
a professor in
Tokyo,
Japan.
spoke Japanese in Japan, an expert in this period. I found from my Princeton professor, who was a friend of mine. Wonderful guy, brilliant guy. Even then, we talked past each other a lot. But fortunately, they had a diary that had never been published. And so Kazu wrote a piece about this. And that diary did have some interesting tidbits in it that helped me. You always want to humanize your characters. And I was able to find this. Togo was an impassive figure, but he had a state of mind. And I could get to it. He was, people deceive themselves. He thought he was going to be able to negotiate a peace through Russia. Nonsense. But even the smart guys convince themselves that it's going to work. And it was a rude shock to him when Russia invaded Japan. And he was devastated by it, but he pulled his socks up and went to plan B.
I should say we luckily found Brian Walsh, the professor in Japan, through a Princeton professor who has become a friend of ours, Paul Miles.
Yeah, a wonderful guy.
Wonderful guy. Lyndon.
What about Truman? Did he feel guilty? And did the moral ambiguity surrounding his decision, would you say it has seriously tarnished his legacy?
No, I mean, his position afterwards increasingly was the buck stops here. There's a scene, which will be in the movie probably, where in November, remember the bomb is August, in November, Oppenheimer comes into the Oval Office and he says, "I have blood on my hands." And Truman kicks him out and says, "I never want to see that crybaby again." And he would mock him, wringing his hands and whining. And so Truman's psychological way of dealing with this was, I took responsibility. It's murky. The real-time record is much, much murkier. I read you that diary entry from the night they gave the order. It's a much less clear thing. And one that, this is all psycho-history, so take it with the appropriate grain of salt. But Truman, as many of you know, was part of the Pendergast machine in Kansas City. And he was the only clean guy. He's the only guy who didn't get rich. But he had to be in this immoral universe, looking the other way as everybody around. He had to permit it in one of his diary entries. He writes about, Jesus, I just let a guy steal $10,000 so that he wouldn't steal more. And was that the right thing to do? He writes in his diary, you decide. So moral ambiguity was not new to Harry Truman. Now, in a venality context, not a life and death context, but, I think there's some overlap.
Scott?
So I'm going to have along the same lines. How do you, as a historian, how do you deal with this problem of intentionally record creation by the actors in the drama? Right? They know this is like a huge drama. In the Truman diary, it comes to mind. I've been assured this and that. It's a military target, whatever. How do you know that he just didn't write that for his own?
It's a huge problem. I mean, it's an enormous problem. If we could make it up, we would, but we can't. I mean, you have to stick with the truth. You can triangulate it. I mean, here's an example of how you could deal in this context.
Yeah.
Winston Churchill, who famously said, history is written by the victors, and I intend to write a lot of it. He wrote 3 volumes about World War II. And in he gives exactly 1 paragraph to strategic bombing, to area bombing, so-called area bombing, because he didn't like it. He didn't like killing civilians. And so he gives it, and that was an important factor in World War II. He gives it a paragraph. And in real time, the idea to bomb Dresden came from Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
Not because he wants to kill a lot of civilians, but because he wants to show the Russians that we're helping them. The Russians are coming into Germany from the east. We're coming in from the west. Dresden and a couple of other cities are in the middle. We want to help out the Russians, show the Russians that we're helping them. And so Churchill says, bomb Dresden. Well, they bombed Dresden a little too well. And in those days, the way the British did it was they create a fire X and drop napalm on it or incendiaries. Wind came up, firestorm, and all of a sudden there's a controversy. What does Churchill do? He goes into the official record and he removes his minute, as they call it. He moves a record that he gave the order. His own people protest. You can't do that. And they put it back in. So sometimes there's a tug of war in real time that you can find. You have to come at it from a lot of different angles. A lot of stuff we'll just never know. There is a little bit of guesswork involved. You have to be honest about it. A lot of you have written history in here. I see Mark Whitaker already here. And you don't understand. You have to at least label it when you're guessing at it. Tell the reader, I'm not sure here, but here's what the evidence shows, and here's my best guess. You have to put a sign on it, but you can't know for sure.
Right.
Goodness. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for excellent talk. I appreciate it a lot. I particularly was interested in the last part of the talk, which creates a certain ambiguity, if not moral, which is the problem of naval intelligence. After all, the driving force behind this narrative is that we have to invade and there will be a terrible, terrible slaughter. But as soon as you get to naval intelligence, the Navy says, oh, well, maybe we don't have to do that. When you take that argument and put it into the narrative, all of a sudden it gets to be even more interesting.
It gets murky because it always is. I mean, here's to give you a real-time example.
Yeah.
So Admiral King says, wait a second. We don't have to invade anymore. The Navy was hit by 2,000 kamikazes off of Okinawa. They're predicting they're going to lose 200 LSTs in the first afternoon. My dad was an executive officer on an LST. So they don't want to, they want to strangle Japan. But General Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, he's an Army guy. The Army believes you can't do it just by ships and planes. You have to have troops on the ground. So Marshall is still pushing for an invasion. But the great General Marshall, who was a wonderful, decent human being, is so exhausted at this point, so worn out, he's saying, well, maybe we should drench them in poison gas. Now, poison gas has been forbidden in World War II, both neither side's using it because of World War I. The sainted General Marshall is saying, well, maybe we should drench them in poison gas, or it gets better. We should drop 9 atom bombs on them as tactical weapons. 3 bombs for each of the 3 landing areas in the front and the back, and then 3 more. We are building them as fast as we can. By November, we probably have 7 or 8. So he's still thinking about invasion. He doesn't know much about radiation. So the idea that we're going to march through these bombs is ridiculous.
He calls General Groves' assistant and says, what are the safety conditions if we're dropping atomic bombs before our soldiers invade? And General Groves' assistant says, well, you have to be 6 miles away and wait 48 hours and you'll be fine.
I mean, the people are rarely that straightforward. General Groves and the scientists are not either hiding the effects of radiation or not inquiring too deeply. Called to testify in November, General Groves is asked about this new thing, radiation. General Groves says, oh, it's a pleasant way to die. As you well know, it's exactly the opposite. So there's a lot of ambiguity in real time and often uneven information or incorrect information or unsure information. That is the reality of real-time intelligence and decision.
And if they had starved them, their casualties would have been even greater.
No, absolutely.
Go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to ask you a question about attitudes towards the strategic or terror bombings in Europe. And I ask this question because I want to know if the leaders who were involved in this decision thought that the terror bombing campaigns in Europe were morally justified in some way, then why are the atomic bombings much more problematic than the European cities or Tokyo? They're problematic because of the type of weapon, which is horrifying.
This is another mud bath, so bear with me for a second. The British, at first nobody wants to bomb cities. The British try to do high-level precision bombing. It fails. They miss. So they start city bombing at night, dropping bombs at night on cities, area bombing. They make a big fire X, drop a lot of bombs. Bomber Harris, the guy who runs the British Air Force, it's okay with him. They talked about dehousing. I can never tell whether this is an ironic term or dehousing the enemy. So the British morally, their cities are being bombed. So why shouldn't we be able to bomb the German city? The Americans take a different view because we're American. We're better than that, and we're technologically proficient. We have something called the Norden bomb sight. So we are going to do, quote, precision bombing by day, which is more dangerous, because we don't want to do city bombing. We don't want to do area bombing. But in Kansas in clear weather with no wind, it works. Over Germany, on a cloudy winter's day with a Luftwaffe shooting at you and flak, it doesn't work. I forget the statistics, but something like 1 bomb and 5 fell within a mile of the target. We were way off. So in effect, we bombed Switzerland twice by mistake. On the day that we bombed Dresden, one group bombed Prague by mistake. Way off. But General Spaatz is trying not to do that. When we're bombing France, he requires his pilots. No radar bombing, can only do by visual bombing because he worries about killing civilians. They know they're killing civilians, but they don't like it. They're uncomfortable with it. And they use a lot of euphemisms so it doesn't sound like they're doing it, versus the British, who are more straightforward about it. Is that confusing enough? I mean, it's a muddle.
Yeah. Peter?
I'm glad you mentioned General Groves' quote. I was reading a book called Fallout, which I'm sure you're probably familiar with.
Right.
That makes a lot of the cover-up, basically, the US cover-up, which General Groves is sort of
Yep.
character number one, and Stimson is
Yeah.
pretty significant on what the effects of the bomb were.
The radiation.
I think that book carries it a bit too far to make a point, but I thought it was very significant that when they have the so-called interim committee meeting, which is a committee of scientists and statesmen that's put together to decide whether to use the bomb and also what the sort of long-term thing is. Some of the people in that room, Conant, the former president of Harvard, the current president of Harvard, Compton, a couple other scientists, they're scientists. They know about radiation, but they don't really inquire that much themselves to find out how bad it is, and they don't share their knowledge with the other people in the room, including Henry Stimson. He did not know about radiation in real time. He finds out about it later. But there's a certain amount of deception even within the US government, and this is murkier, a kind of lack of inquiry or kind of not really wanting to know. This was very true of Groves in particular. He wanted to get this damn thing done. Thank God we had Groves. He was an incredibly effective person. He forced people to make this bomb. He got it done. A lesser guy probably wouldn't have been able to do it. But he was a morally ambiguous person, as you kind of had to be. I don't know how else to put it. And he did not really inquire too deeply. And he gave that ridiculous quote that radiation, I hear radiation is a pleasant way to die. Did he believe that? I doubt it, but he said it.
We have, I think, a question from the live stream that might be a good follow-up for this.
Sure.
I might throw this in. The historian Richard B. Frank has written that Operation Olympic was secretly taken off the table by Truman and his war planners based on estimated casualties and Japanese radio traffic indicating a military buildup on Kyushu. So Americans were led to believe a false alternative to dropping the bomb. Please comment.
Well, he's absolutely right, and Frank is a great source on this. In fact, he's the leading scholar on this, that we did take it off the table. I don't think that was a cover-up. After, the sequence on this is that at first everybody's feeling bad because it did save a lot of lives, American as well as Japanese. And then, of course, John Hersey writes Hiroshima a year later. And all of a sudden, oh my God, we discover from the story of 6 people who have been through this, how grisly and awful it was. Well, then the establishment has to respond. And Henry Stimson, our boy Henry Stimson, writes an article that's published in Harper's Book, it's publicized everywhere, which makes a defense. And they leave out things like the thing that the viewer was just asking about, this underneath history. He doesn't get into that because it's too complicated and because he doesn't want to raise other questions. I mean, there is a kind of a cover-up. Stimson himself feels guilty about this. And he writes Felix Frankfurter, his buddy, and says, I feel terrible about this. And Frankfurter basically says, don't be a crybaby. You know, suck it up.
He sends Frankfurter his draft.
Yeah, Frankfurter basically says, suck it up. And, but Grew, the acting Secretary of State, who'd been working with Stimson to try to get Japan to surrender by allowing them to keep their emperor, which there's been a debate over doing that, writes Stimson saying, you know, we should have done that and maybe avoided the bomb. And Stimson doesn't answer him for 6 months. He's guilty about this and bothered by it. Now, what Stimson didn't know is just how adamant the Japanese were. I conclude, but Stimson didn't have I conclude, basically by the research of Richard Frank and others, that the Japanese weren't going to surrender. So the idea of saying, oh, you can keep the emperor, that wouldn't have worked. That would have just emboldened them to keep on fighting. Stimson's like most great men. He's a very complicated guy. He was both a great moralist. He talked about the law of moral progress. He saw himself as a Christian gentleman. He really did see himself that way. He was also a power guy, a hard-nosed pragmatist. He always thought what a mistake it was to allow Lee to retreat from Gettysburg, that Meade should have chased down Lee. And twice, Henry Stimson saved the job of General Patton, who almost got fired twice for striking a soldier in combat fatigue. Stimson saved his job because he knew that Patton was good at chasing a retreating enemy mercilessly and relentlessly. So Stimson understood power and the uses of power, but he also saw himself as a Christian gentleman. Well, which was he? Both. That is the history of American foreign policy. It is. Think about it. We have this idealism, human rights, democracy. We're going to spread this around the world. We do. We have. We tried. And at the same time, we're realists. We're a great power. We're a superpower. We use power, sometimes ruthlessly and relentlessly. We do both things. Is there a conflict there? Yes. Is it a conflict that we've had to live with for certainly our modern history? Yes. Will we continue to have to live with that? Yes.
Yes, sir.
I was very reassured by your opinion that the bomb will not be used again. I would like to.
I'm not assured of that.
I thought you said that it's unlikely.
I said we mustn't.
Yes.
But I didn't say it wouldn't.
Oh, okay. I'm less.
I feel strong. I wrote a book about Dwight Eisenhower's nuclear policy. And interestingly, in the 1950s, there was a lot of talk, starting to be talked with Henry Kissinger and others, about the idea of a limited nuclear war. That we could start a war and lob a few bombs and then stop it. Dwight Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, never believed that. You know, Clausewitz' famous saying, war is just politics by another means, or war is politics by another means. That's not what President Eisenhower got from Clausewitz. President Eisenhower and Clausewitz was, once wars start, you can't stop them, particularly wars of national survival. They get out of control. So in the 1950s, Eisenhower was determined that the United States not get in a war, even a limited war. Why? Because he was afraid they wouldn't be able to stop it. Eisenhower was the only modern president who never lost a soldier during his time in office. He was damned if he was going to get into some kind of limited war, particularly a limited nuclear war. I'm sorry to say that we're starting to talk again about limited nuclear war, the use of tactical nuclear weapons. It's starting to pop up again in our war planning. When we think about battle over Taiwan or war over Taiwan, you can hear this talk again about limited. And I just don't believe that.
Well, Putin has done some nuclear saber rattling talking in terms of the countries that help Ukraine seeing consequences you've never seen before. So it's worrisome, to say the least. Yes?
I was interested in your brief mention of Curtis LeMay and napalm, because I hadn't realized that those two had such a long history when we think about Vietnam and how well publicized that association was and how well publicized napalm's horrific impacts were. During the Second War, was it widely known in America, or was it just thought this is just part of the price they have to pay?
You know, it's interesting about public opinion. The facts are that napalm was invented in the Harvard University soccer field. First time they used it in 1943. By 1945, they built a pretty good incendiary bomb. And we had a lot of them, and we used them to burn Tokyo. In fact, more people were killed in Tokyo on one night in March than were killed in Hiroshima. 100,000 people in 6 hours, the greatest death toll in the history of warfare ever. From burning 16 square miles with napalm, with incendiaries. And of course, famously later in Vietnam. But that's where it gets a start. It's not that Curtis LeMay was a butcher. He's been caricatured because he was a tough talking guy, chewed on a cigar. He tried precision bombing. It didn't work. He tried to bomb military targets, factories, submarine pens from 30,000 feet. The bombs missed. He was afraid that he was about to lose his job and get sacked if he didn't produce some results. So he came up with this idea: we'll go in low at night and drop incendiaries and start a firestorm. And they did.
And the papers were covering it at the time.
You know, I'm sorry. This is an important thing. I'm sorry, I got off track here to answer your question. This is puzzling. The New York Times headlines said we burned square miles. It wasn't a secret. We were burning cities. But there wasn't much public reaction to it. And Henry Stimson, of all people, said at the meeting when they were together talking about the future of the atom bomb and whether we should use it in this case, he expressed regret that the public wasn't raising a stink about firebombing. He was kind of puzzled by it. Why aren't more people upset about what it is that we're doing? I don't have a really good answer to that, except that people wanted this damn war over. John Dower of MIT wrote a book about how in warfare you turn your enemies into animals. And we had, this is what was it called? War Without Mercy by John Dower. You know, we regarded the Japanese as gorillas and insects. They regarded us as monsters. They're cartoons in our newspapers. You have to dehumanize the other side to kill them. And by 1945, we had pretty well, the General Slim, the British general in Burma, said that the Japanese soldier is the greatest fighting insect in history. That's how they viewed the enemy. And it was kind of psychologically necessary if you're going to do this slaughter. And the American people, you know, they bought into it. The churches complained a little bit, but not that much.
I saw the lights dimming. And Sarah,
It's an accidental.
oh, I wondered if that was a signal.
It's happened.
Yes, on the couch.
So really such an informative talk. I think it's great to have two speakers. There's a lot of extra to talk about. My question is, from the Japanese perspective, how do they view the decisions to use nuclear weapons? Did they believe it was terrible but unbalanced? Did they believe it saved more? What's the Japanese perspective?
Yeah, great
The
question.
question is, what's the Japanese perspective on our use of the 2 nuclear weapons on their cities?
What's the answer?
If you go to the museum, as we have in Hiroshima, they write that it was understandable, they had bombed Pearl Harbor, and it was understandable that we dropped nuclear bombs on a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima because it did have military aspects to the city. And if you go to Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, which is controversial every time a Japanese prime minister does go, you will find that they say that the Americans forced Japan to bomb Pearl Harbor and that they had no alternative. And they tell 2 stories to themselves.
Yeah, they do. We had the experience for the earlier book of going to the Japanese Naval Academy called Etajima. The Japanese are against militarism, you know, and they don't call it a navy, they call it a maritime self-defense force, because navy is a militaristic word, okay? So we're at the Japanese Self-Defense Forces Academy, but we met with the midshipmen who are all dressed in these British Navy uniforms. They have a lock of Lord Nelson's hair.
And a bust of John Paul Jones.
And a bust of John Paul Jones. So these midshipmen, okay, war is constitutionally, it's against the Constitution, but the Japanese midshipmen are required to go to the museum there, which is full of monuments and testimonials to people who died for their country. Japanese people who died for their country, including a room in which they have letters on the wall from Etajima graduates, Naval Academy graduates, who died as kamikazes, apologizing to their parents for dying before them. In Japanese culture, you're not supposed to die before your parents. And one of these letters is written in blood. So it's just completely conflicting things. War is bad, but on the other hand, the most noble thing you can do is die for your country. Well, which is it? Both, or either or. I don't know. I mean, we talked to 6 of these midshipmen. They were completely puzzled by this. They didn't have coherent answers.
Sarah, how long should we go?
Maybe one more question, if there is one more.
Sure.
There are 2 more questions, let's say. Yeah,
I have a
yes,
question.
yes.
The atomic bomb was developed under the Manhattan Project, right here where we live. Then moved to New Mexico so many years ago. And the secrets to it were given by the Rosenbergs to Russia. And yet all these years have passed, and countries like Iran, to this day, how many years later, still is refining uranium to build the first nuclear bomb. Why does it take them so long?
Because the Israelis keep sabotaging it in Iran's case. I mean, they could have done it earlier, but I'm not being facetious. The Iranians have sabotaged it several times, and we have helped them. Stuxnet, is it called? This bug that we put in the nuclear accelerators in Iran bought us a few years. They're very close again. They use it as a kind of a bargaining chip, but they're close. The Japanese could do it very quickly if they chose to. They're waiting. They want to remain non-nuclear. As long as we have the 7th Fleet, they're protecting them. I'm not sure how long that's going to last, because the animosity grows between China and Japan again. The Israelis have a bomb. I mean, plenty of people have them.
This, it's relevant today. Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons at the end of the Soviet Union in return for a Russian guarantee that they would never be invaded.
Can't bank on that.
Yeah. Yeah, Elizabeth.
So, I'm being stupid a bit, but between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, how many days?
How many days? 3 days. August 6th and August 9th.
Was there a discussion anywhere that you found that said, okay, let's do one and see if it works?
That's a good question, and historians have asked it, and I have a kind of a murky answer. The original order was, as Oscie mentioned, was to bomb 4 cities, and with bombs as made ready. And they gave the control of that to the military. For one thing, weather was a big factor. It was a typhoon season's coming in. They don't know when they're going to be able to do it. They only have 2 bombs initially. So they basically delegated that control. The original date was August 11th, but they worried that weather was closing in, so they moved it up to August 9th. There was not a lot of debate about this, but we heard from Paul Miles, actually, our friend Paul Miles in the Small World Department. His great mentor at West Point had been Colonel Lincoln, General Lincoln. Lincoln was Marshall's chief planner. And he was in the office with Marshall on about August 7th, when John McCloy, who was Stimson's closest aide, said to him, do you think we should wait here? And Marshall said, what did he say exactly?
This man is tottering, meaning the emperor. We need to finish him.
We need to give him a push.
And Stimson did not think 2 bombs would be enough. He was going on off to his to the Oscie Club.
Yeah, they thought more was coming. The formula the Groves used to use, 1 to show the Japanese we have one, 2 to show them that we have more than 1. But they were, cranking these things out as fast as they could. Truman stopped the process and then restarted it again. And we were going to have a 3rd bomb ready by about August 20th. The war ends on August 15th.
On that note, I think we thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.